I've always had a thing for rare, old items, the kind of relics that seem to carry a piece of the past in them. I suppose that fascination is what drove me to become an antique collector. My weekends were spent combing through flea markets, estate sales, and even traveling to remote, forgotten towns where shops and attics held dusty, hidden treasures. But over the years, I started hearing stories about an elusive artifact that captured my attention more than anything else I'd ever come across: the Traveler's Mirror. Every collector had heard of it, whispered about it. It was said to be a mirror like no other, a piece that didn't show you as you were, but instead revealed a place you would soon find yourself. There was no clear history. Some called it cursed, claiming that those who saw their reflections in it would disappear shortly after. Others said it was a myth, a ghost story among collectors. But the allure of finding it consumed me. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I could just see it, just touch it, I might unlock some mystery no one else had. Months of searching, sifting through records and odd leads, finally took me to an old, sprawling estate hidden in the woods a few hours out of town. The place was decrepit, untouched for years, with vines snaking up its weathered walls and windows clouded with grime. Rumor had it that the previous owner had vanished without a trace, leaving behind this crumbling mansion and his collection of strange artifacts. When I entered the house, the air felt thick, weighed down by an unsettling silence. Every room I passed was filled with dust-covered relics, things that would have excited me under different circumstances, but I was focused. Eventually, after an hour of navigating through narrow rooms and cluttered halls, I found it. A tall mirror draped in a heavy, dark cloth, tucked away in the back of an unlit room. The cloth felt rough in my hands as I pulled it back, and there it was, the Traveler's Mirror. Its frame was intricate, adorned with symbols I didn't recognize, and the glass had a slightly smoky quality, as if veiled in mist. For a moment, I just stared at my reflection, but something about it felt off. The outline of my figure was there, but everything beyond me in the glass seemed faded, distorted, like the mirror was showing me a place that wasn't quite my own room. I tried to shake off the feeling, dismissing it as excitement or nerves. I packed the mirror carefully, brought it home, and mounted it on the wall of my study, convincing myself it was just another prize for my collection. That night, as I tried to work at my desk, an unusual tension hung in the air. The room felt colder than usual, even though the heat was on, and I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. I dismissed it, buried myself in my work, but then I heard a faint creak, a soft shifting sound coming from the direction of the mirror. I glanced over, expecting to see my reflection staring back, but the glass seemed dark, almost as if it was absorbing the dim light instead of reflecting it. I got up, inspected the frame, and convinced myself that the noise was nothing more than the house settling, or the old wood adjusting to its new surroundings. Over the next few nights, however, the sounds became more pronounced. A quiet shuffling when I was alone in the room, the almost imperceptible hiss of something brushing past the mirror's surface. I told myself it was my imagination, that the stories had gotten under my skin. But then I started noticing subtle changes in the room. Books shifted on the shelves, a chair would be angled differently, and once, I found a lamp tilted as if it had been touched. Each time, I tried to rationalize it, telling myself I'd simply forgotten or knocked something out of place. Yet, the unease grew, a heavy knot in my chest that tightened every time I looked at the mirror. It never felt like it was reflecting me. Instead, it seemed like something just beyond the glass was watching back. One night, as I sat at my desk, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned quickly, expecting to see someone, standing by the mirror, but the room was empty. The glass was dark again, my reflection barely visible. I approached, peering into it, feeling a strange pull, like it wanted me to lean in closer. And then, just barely, I heard it, a soft, almost inaudible scrape, like nails lightly dragging against the frame. My stomach twisted, and I backed away slowly, trying to ignore the chills spreading up my spine. The following days grew worse. I began finding doors open that I knew I'd closed, and objects rearranged in ways that were subtle but impossible to ignore. Sometimes, I'd hear faint, unidentifiable noises coming from different parts of the house, only to trace them back to the mirror. Once, late at night, I was woken by the creak of my study door inching open, and I lay frozen, my mind racing with fear, knowing I hadn't left it ajar. It felt as though the very air around me was shifting, thickening, becoming charged with a presence I couldn't see. And then, one evening, as I tried to gather my thoughts in the dim light of the study, I noticed something chilling. In the mirror's reflection, a faint, misty outline hovered just beyond my shoulder. I whipped around, heart pounding, but there was no one there. When I looked back at the glass, the outline had vanished, leaving me staring at my pale, unsettled reflection. I tried to calm myself, but every time I glanced at the mirror, I felt that something was lurking, inching closer each night, pressing against the barrier of the glass as if waiting for just the right moment to slip through. The final straw came the next night. I'd been lying in bed, unable to sleep, when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Not heavy, deliberate steps, but a faint, slow scuff, as if something was moving, dragging itself across the floor. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, straining to hear as the sounds grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside my bedroom door. There was a long silence, an excruciating pause, before I heard the faintest shift, like someone or something brushing against the wood. My hand shook as I reached for the lamp, flicking it on, heart hammering, but nothing appeared in the doorway. The footsteps had vanished as quickly as they'd come. I rushed to my study, determined to confront whatever was happening. But as I stepped inside, the mirror seemed darker than ever, a black void swallowing the room's reflection. I felt that unshakable presence, a tension so thick I could barely breathe. The air around me felt oppressive, and I could have sworn I heard a faint, raspy breath coming from just behind me. I closed my eyes, the hairs on my neck standing on end, as I felt an invisible weight pressing down, surrounding me. When I opened them again, the mirror's surface seemed to ripple, like something was pressing against it from the other side, testing the barrier. That night, I didn't sleep. Every creak, every faint murmur of movement kept me on edge, my eyes darting back to the mirror, half expecting something to reach through, to break the silence with a whisper just behind me. And yet, even as dawn approached, I couldn't bring myself to move it, to rid myself of it. It felt like any attempt to do so would only invite whatever lurked within to lash out, to come through in ways I wasn't prepared for. I'm not sure how much longer I can last, the fear gnawing at my mind, knowing that invisible things are slowly, deliberately creeping into my life from a place beyond my understanding, crossing that fragile line between their world and mine. The next morning, I'd had enough. The eerie presence that had crept into my home was no longer something I could ignore or rationalize. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from that mirror, biding its time, The dread that had settled over me was unbearable. So, with more desperation than I cared to admit, I decided to get rid of it. The moment the sun was up, I marched into the study, avoiding my own reflection as I approached the mirror, hands trembling slightly as I lifted it off the wall. Even through the gloves I'd hastily put on, the frame felt unnervingly cold, as if it were draining the warmth from my hands. I took it outside to the garage, planning to drive to the outskirts of town and dump it in some forgotten field or secluded grove, anywhere it could be far away from me. But just as I was about to load it into the trunk, I paused. Something in the reflection caught my eye. The background was distorted, rippling faintly, as if it were underwater. And for a fleeting moment, I could have sworn I saw a hint of movement deep within the glass, like something turning away, vanishing into darkness as I stared. I shivered and slammed the trunk shut, unwilling to give myself time to reconsider. I drove for nearly an hour, winding down unfamiliar back roads until I found a clearing far off the beaten path, surrounded by tall, dense trees that swallowed any sound. The whole area felt isolated, swallowed by silence, exactly the kind of place where I could leave something undisturbed. Without a second thought, I carried the mirror to the center of the clearing, leaning it carefully against a fallen log, and then turned away, feeling an intense urge to distance myself from it as quickly as possible. That night, I went to bed with a sense of relief, believing I was finally rid of it. But when I woke the next morning, an uneasy feeling settled in my stomach before I even opened my eyes. My body felt tense, my mind foggy with an instinctual dread. For a few minutes, I lay there, hoping it was all just lingering anxiety. Then I forced myself to get up, to shake it off. I made my way to the study, intending to immerse myself in work, but the moment I opened the door, I stopped cold. There it was, the mirror back in its place on the wall as if it had never left. My mind reeled. I was absolutely certain I'd left it miles away in that clearing. I felt my knees weaken, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts as I stared at the mirror, almost expecting it to respond, to laugh, to do something that would confirm the nightmare unfolding before me. The air in the room felt thick again, that strange, oppressive energy pressing down on me, making my skin crawl. I backed out of the study, slamming the door, heart pounding as I tried to make sense of it. Had someone returned it? But who would even know and why? Refusing to let fear get the better of me, I decided to try again, but this time I was more determined. I wrapped the mirror in thick blankets, bound it with rope, and lugged it into the car once more, barely able to look at it. This time, I drove to an old, desolate quarry on the outskirts of town, far deeper and more secluded than the clearing. I could feel its weight in the trunk the whole way, like it was pulling me backward, its icy energy seeping through the walls of the car. When I arrived, I unwrapped the blankets, trying not to look at its surface, and dragged it to the very edge of the cliff overlooking the quarry below. Without hesitation, I pushed it over the edge, watching as it tumbled down, shattering against the rocks below in a dozen fragments. But the moment I got home, an overwhelming sense of dread returned. The house felt off, too quiet, too still, like it was holding its breath, waiting for me. Against my better judgment, I slowly walked toward the study, each step weighed down by an unnatural resistance. I didn't want to open the door. I knew what I would find, yet I couldn't stop myself. I turned the handle and pushed the door open, my heart sinking as I saw it. The mirror was there again, intact, flawless, mounted on the wall in exactly the same place as before, almost mocking me with its pristine reflection. I staggered back, feeling as if the room were closing in around me. This time, the air was colder than ever, my breath coming out in shallow puffs as I struggled to make sense of the impossibility before me. I hadn't even closed my eyes for a moment, yet here it was, as though it had never left, as if it belonged here. I considered calling someone for help, but who could I tell? What could I even say without sounding insane? Each time I tried to rid myself of the mirror, it returned, almost effortlessly, its presence growing stronger. The strange disturbances escalated, the noises becoming more distinct, more unsettling. At night, I'd hear soft sounds like someone or something moving around, the subtle creaks of the floor, the gentle brushing of fabric against walls. And each time I dared to open my door, my study would be empty, save for the mirror, standing silently, its dark surface seeming to pulse with a sinister life of its own. At times, I would see fleeting impressions within the glass, barely perceptible movements, shapes that slipped away when I tried to focus. The reflections had become murky, as if the mirror wasn't showing my study anymore, but some shadowy place I couldn't recognize. The longer I stared, the more I felt as though something on the other side was watching, waiting for me to falter, to let my guard down. I began to sleep less, haunted by the knowledge that no matter how far I went, no matter how many times I disposed of it, the mirror would always return. Its invisible inhabitants, whatever they were, had followed me home. And each night, as I lay in bed, I'd hear them moving about, slowly growing bolder, their faint, eerie sounds drawing closer to my bedroom door, testing my resolve, pushing the limits of my sanity. Eventually, I boarded up the study, hoping that keeping it out of sight would ease my mind, but it only made things worse. Now, I'd catch glimpses in other reflections around the house. A faint, indistinct outline in the windows, an unfamiliar shape lingering in the glossy surface of my phone screen, something barely visible hovering behind me in the bathroom mirror. It was everywhere, spreading, like whatever I'd brought home was no longer bound to that single frame. My entire house had become its hunting ground, each corner holding the suggestion of something that didn't belong, a silent reminder that I was no longer alone. The nights became unbearable. The sounds continued, creeping ever closer, as if testing the boundaries, learning how far it could push. I'd wake to the sensation of cold air pressing down on my skin, to the faintest rustling sounds just beyond my door. Each time I opened my eyes, I feared I'd find that indistinct shape hovering over me, but I never did. It stayed just out of sight, just beyond my reach, always waiting, always watching. And now, as I sit here, trapped within my own home, I realized that getting rid of the mirror was never an option. Whatever came through that glass is here to stay, no longer confined to the frame. It's free now, inhabiting the quiet spaces of my life, lurking in the silence, in the darkened corners, just beyond where I can see. And each night, as the house settles and the oppressive quiet returns, I know it's still there, waiting, lurking in the depths of the shadows, and inching ever closer. The final days felt like an eternity. Every waking moment was plagued by that suffocating dread, the constant awareness that something was near, watching, creeping ever closer with each passing night. The house felt like a trap now, every room a stifling prison where the air itself seemed to thicken, pressing down on me, urging me to leave yet binding me in fear. The subtle disturbances grew more insistent, more menacing, and it became impossible to ignore them. One night, as I lay there in the dark, The quiet hum of the house took on an unfamiliar rhythm, a subtle, pulsing beat that grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was right beside me. I lay completely still, eyes closed, willing myself not to look, not to give in to the morbid curiosity clawing at me. I could hear a faint whispering, like breaths just beyond my reach, merging and mutating into unintelligible murmurs. They were too quiet to understand, but too close to ignore, winding their way into my thoughts, filling the room with an unnatural resonance. My heart pounded as the sounds grew clearer, layered, as though dozens of voices were speaking just out of sight, murmuring secrets that I was never meant to hear. The door to my room creaked open slowly, a sound I'd grown used to, but this time it didn't stop. I felt the pressure change, a rush of icy air slithering into the room, bringing with it that unmistakable feeling of something stepping through the threshold. I kept my eyes shut, clenching my fists beneath the blanket, heart racing, feeling that dark presence wash over me, engulfing me in a sensation of being utterly alone yet completely surrounded. I could sense something standing right beside my bed, a chill radiating from its unseen form as it loomed over me, closer than it had ever dared before. I couldn't resist anymore. I opened my eyes, just a crack, and instantly regretted it. In the dim light, I caught the faintest glimpse of a figure, a mere suggestion of a form that seemed to shift and distort in the darkness. It wasn't solid. It was like a distortion in the air, an outline that made no sense, moving subtly as though observing me, considering me. I closed my eyes again, hoping it hadn't noticed, that maybe it would leave, but the air grew colder, its presence pressing down harder, a weight that seemed to seep into my very bones. Then, slowly, I heard footsteps moving around my room, soft and deliberate, tracing the perimeter as though inspecting every inch. I felt my breath hitch, lying motionless as the sound circled around me. Closer, closer. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would give me away. And then it stopped right at the foot of my bed. I held my breath, waiting, the silence stretching into an eternity, until I heard it. A soft, almost curious whisper, so close to my face it felt like icy fingers grazing my skin. It was saying my name over and over, in a voice that was neither male nor female, young nor old, a fractured tone that echoed through my skull. Desperation clawed at me, and I bolted upright, gasping, hoping that somehow breaking the silence would chase it away. But the room was empty. Nothing lingered, nothing waited in the shadows. Yet I knew, deep down, that it was still there, still watching. I couldn't take it anymore. I stumbled out of bed, heading down the hallway to the study, driven by a compulsion I didn't understand, feeling as though something was guiding my movements, pushing me forward. When I entered the study, I was met with silence. The mirror was there, of course, exactly where it had always been, its surface dark, almost absorbing the dim light. I approached it, almost hypnotized, feeling that if I could just understand what was behind the glass, maybe I could end this torment. I stood before it, staring into the depths of its reflection, and for the first time, it felt like the mirror was no longer reflecting my study. It was showing somewhere else, some dark, empty place that stretched infinitely, an endless void that called to me. I reached out, my hand hovering just above the glass, feeling a strange warmth radiate from it, as if something was waiting, something that would grab hold of me if I dared touch the surface. And then I saw them. Pale, ghastly hands began to press against the other side, faintly visible, reaching up from the depths, sliding slowly, almost lovingly, over the inside of the glass. They multiplied, more and more hands pressing up, each one different. Some slender, some gnarled and twisted, as though the mirror held an army of restless souls, each desperate to escape, to break through the fragile barrier that separated their world from mine. I stumbled back, heart racing, unable to tear my eyes away as the hands pressed harder, stretching the glass as if it were a thin veil, threatening to break through. A single crack began to spread from the corner, spider webbing across the surface. The sound was sharp, almost unbearable, like nails on a chalkboard, and I backed away, horrified, as the figures behind the glass became clearer, their outlines sharpening, faces beginning to form. Faces twisted in agony, eyes dark and hollow, each one bearing an expression of hunger, as though they'd been waiting for someone like me to let them through. The crack grew wider, and I knew with absolute certainty that if it shattered, they'd spill out into my world, flooding my home, consuming everything. I had to do something, anything, to stop it. In a blind panic, I grabbed the blanket I'd left on the armchair and threw it over the mirror, shrouding it in darkness. The pressure in the room lifted slightly, the sounds muffling, but I knew this wasn't over. I could still hear them, faintly, beneath the fabric, scratching, whispering, promising they'd find a way through, that it was only a matter of time. I staggered back, my mind racing, trapped in the horrifying realization that no matter what I did, I couldn't escape. They'd marked me. Even if I destroyed the mirror, even if I left, they would follow. I could feel them watching from every reflective surface, lurking just beyond the edges of my vision, waiting for that one moment when I'd slip, when I'd look too closely, when I'd finally give in to the pull. And in that moment, I knew that it wasn't just my house that they wanted. It was me. The last night I spent in that house, I could barely breathe, every second filled with dread, every sound magnified, my pulse racing as I tried to ignore the quiet, insistent murmur of voices just beyond the walls. They were everywhere, in the mirrors, in the windows, in the glass of the picture frames. I caught glimpses of fingers pressing against the glass, faces beginning to take shape in every reflection, watching me, waiting for me to falter. As the dawn approached, I grabbed my keys, too terrified to stay a moment longer. I fled, leaving the house and everything in it behind, hoping that somehow, putting distance between us would make it stop. But even as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on the back of my neck, the faint, eerie sensation of hands reaching for me, just out of sight. I had realized that this mirror indirectly showed me my fate, my future, that I was doomed. And every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I could see them, just a flicker at the edge, a faint distortion, reminding me that no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, they would always be there, watching, waiting, and I could never escape.